I'm Paul DiPasquale, and my role in taking down the statues and the pedestals on Monument Avenue was watching out for the safety of taking the statues down and advising on how to cut them if they needed to be cut for transport, and then how to transport them. So I was chosen for that role because I put the Arthur Ashe monument up in 1996, and the city figured that if I could do that, I could probably have some insight into how to take down the monuments as well. Well, of course, the monuments went up for a lot of different reasons at the time they went up. Served the purpose primarily as monuments to the lost cause. So books have been written about it with that name. And I think that the initial effect was to make the leadership of the South feel better about having given way in the war between the states. So over the years, I think what happened is the monuments became an attraction because they were well built, well designed, and sculpted at the time. And the monument of Lee initiated Monument Avenue, and the money that came there in the housing and in the development of the avenue itself was top rate. So people wanted to see it. Some people wanted to see it because of the interest in the war and what these people represented to the South and what they represented to history. Other people wanted to see it just because they were beautiful, well done, and the avenue itself won many awards for design internationally as well as nationally. So of course all that changed, as is the case of history, and more knowledge is found out about history. The story changes. So the question of states' rights being the cause of the Civil War as opposed to slavery being the cause of the Civil War became more and more debated. And I think it's easy to look at the George Floyd murder and understand that that became a flashpoint across the nation. Richmond was insulated, I believe, for a while after the riot in Charlottesville, because they did have a statue to Arthur Ashe as a modern hero. So there was context in the sense that here's our modern hero, and here are the heroes of the past, and that was in the past. But George Floyd blew all that out of the water, of course. My initial conversations with the city was based on how to move the statues. They had information from the state, from the conservator for the state's sculptures, specifically the monument of Robert E. Lee. The information they were getting was that the horses, the equestrian statues, could not be put on their side, that they would have to travel, if this is a horse, standing up. The information they got was if the horse was on its side, it would collapse due to the weight of the body of the horse. The person who, or the people who thought that were ill-informed. That's all there is to it. In the making of a bronze horse, or any bronze with the lost wax process, the pieces are in wax. They're a hollow casting of the original clay piece, But those wax pieces have to be able to withstand the pressure of being on their side or standing up. Often they're cut into pieces and then put back together. But if you just think about it as a bronze, if the horse is going to collapse on its side, it's also going to collapse standing up. So what was a problem is if you put a horse with a rider on its side, there are stirrups sticking out and there are accessories that will get bent. So the question is, what kind of dunnage do you put down on the truck before you put the statue on its side? So I came up with an answer to both of those things. First of all, the idea of riding a horse, so the rest of the story from the state was, well, if you ride the horse standing up, you have to shorten the statue so it can go underneath the traffic lights.
Oh, yeah.
So in the case of the Stewart monument, Jeb Stewart, that would require cutting the head off the statue. In the case of Jackson, that would require cutting it off at the bust. Both of those optics at the time would have further excited the crowd watching it, and you can't get rid of the crowd. But aside from that, it's just not necessary. Of course, Robert E. Lee, the initial discussion that kicked everything off was the state wanting to take the Lee statue down. That was in early June of 2020. So they said they were going to take it apart the same way it was put together. And that statue was put together on site with three large pieces. The figure itself of Lee, and then the horse with from the waist down of the figure on the horse. That was the second piece, and then the third piece were the legs and the base plate. So those three pieces were sleeved together or joined together on site. So if this is the belly of the Lee figure, and this is the belt or the waist of the figure on the horse, it would slide in like this, and then there were holes drilled previously all the way around the piece. Pins, bronze pins or dowels, were driven into those holes, and they were burnished so you couldn't see them. So to take those pins out, it meant they would have to be drilled out. So that's over 24 holes that would have to be drilled out, and the pin is not going to be perpendicular to the surface. It's a topographical variable surface, and the pins are going to be in all different directions, slightly different directions, but still that means a bigger and bigger hole. So they after realizing that, they said, well, we said we were going to take it apart the same way it was put together, and we can't do that, but we're still going to take it apart, so we're going to cut it at the waist. At that point, I wasn't asked to advise the state. I was just advising the city. And but I said that is also not necessary, because what we're going to do, Jackson ended up being the first monument to come down. And the plan with that one was to not put it parallel on the truck bed of the tractor trailer, but to put it at an angle. And that does two things. It allows the weight to be more evenly distributed. If it's parallel, then you've got the body of the horse, which is the heaviest, and the base plate, and that is going to lean the truck this way. So it really had to be put on at a diagonal. And if anything had to be cut off, it would be minimal. It would be part of the base plate and maybe a leg of the horse. And that's a lot easier to weld back on, should you want to do that, which is what we were watching out for, than cutting the head off or cutting it at the bust. And certainly in the case of Lee, cutting it at the waist. So those things were, in my mind, to be avoided. So what we did for Jackson is put down tires, automobile tires that were clean, and pallets. and stacked them so that we could support the body of the horse and let the accessories like the stirrups or a sword or elbows or whatever could just hang down, and the tires would support the body of the horse. So that's what I did for the city, and I was able to do field drawings on site to show to the riggers who were strapping the horse, take it off the lift, as well as to turn it and then lay it back down on the truck. So those are the two things at that point. The other part that I was needed for was how to get the statues off the pedestal or the stone base. In all cases, there were bolts holding them. In some cases, you couldn't see the bolts. So we devised a way to do that by cutting around the bolt, so that would free the base plate from the base, the stone base, and when the statue's lifted, that cut area would just drop down, and you could cut the bolt at that point, pull the cut area up, which is could be 6 by 6 or maybe larger, but we didn't know at the time how big it would be because there's support underneath it that you can't see. So there was always a plan A and a plan B, and in some cases, well, if neither of those things work, we'll get out the chainsaw, so to speak. But we never got to that. We didn't have a chainsaw, but we had to. My point is making major cuts, which proved unnecessary. When putting a statue up, I often think about this will eventually come down. It'll either eventually fall down, or it'll be knocked down by a hurricane or a tornado, or in the case of like the statue of Neptune at the Virginia Beach, which is 32 feet tall it's 15 feet on top of 12 feet of rock, but the trident makes up for the 32 feet. But that piece will eventually be covered in water, if not just a storm surge or waves with the rising sea. If it lasts that long, water will be washing across the base of that piece. So I imagine these sculptures coming down or being in ruins. And they look like that in pieces going up. So in pieces coming down, it's a question of figuring out how they were put up, what they went through to get them in place, and what the wax pieces looked like so that they would withstand the casting once the pieces were welded together in the shop and then bolted together on site. A good example for that is the Maury Monument, which is a sphere. Primarily it's the sphere of the earth with figures all the way around it. And the question that the riggers had in mind was, can we strap the sphere? Will it stand the lifting of 10,000 pounds or more? We don't know how much it weighs yet. Maybe 15. And so looking at the sphere, I figured out it was put together like the sections of an orange and bolted along the seams. I didn't know how they were bolted because that's inside. But as these sections came together, they would support strapping around the circumference of the sphere low down on the piece. And then it would those straps would be choked at the top, so it would they wouldn't move. So looking at Maury, the main rigger on site was Jimmy. He was the lead guy. And he said, well, I'm nervous about that, so how about if we strap to some of the figures? And I said, those are good. Those are going to be bolted into place too. But a combination of that is we're over 100% correct. It's not going to damage the sculpture. So he went with that, and it turned out from my point of view, it was really interesting to get up underneath the Maury and take a picture of those orange sections, and they were just butt jointed together. So they came together like this, if this is a section coming up, like that, and they just put a bolt like every 4 inches all the way up. So probably 500 bolts held that thing together. And they were all iron or steel, and so they were rusting away inside there, which means eventually they would be gone. And then it's going to come apart. So everything you put up is going to come down. Or I like to say in my business, it's not how you make it, it's how you fix it. I think starting out at the beginning of the project, the biggest difficulty was the concern and worry about people's reaction. There were people that wanted the statues down fervently, and there were people who did not want them down. And they both showed up. And they both showed up with the mindset of a crowd, and the crowd mentality of screaming and yelling in unison to support their cause, whatever their cause is. So Devon Henry, who headed up the team, pulled everybody together, got everybody facing the same direction, was keenly aware of this, and as a black man felt he was a target, and his workers as well. And they were, in the sense, black or white, people didn't like them. Some people didn't like them. And so their worry was what would happen to the trucks, what would happen to the business. And that's why Devon pulled people from as far away as Connecticut and upstate New York, stone people from Minnesota and Wisconsin. So he pulled these people together and got them speaking the same language as to how to do that with me, as to what my thoughts on it were. And of course their thoughts were about how the machinery is going to operate. My thoughts are how the sculpture is going to react to that, and trying to fit that together. And that was the easy part. So the difficulties initially were, what kind of police protection are we going to get? And police was a bad word at that time for some people. And protection was questionable at that time. When Richmond had the added difficulty of just firing the police chief, and then hiring a new one, and then the new one quitting. So a temporary police chief. So we couldn't, and then there was the legal question of taking the statues down. Added on top of that variable is, where are the police? Who's going to assign the police? That was a question. And then legally, do we have clearance to take them down? So the city attorney is arguing that with the mayor, and then there's no police chief to fit into that triad of a decision. You need the legal, you need the mayor and the council to approve it, and you need protection. And so the sheriff stood up and said, and she said, my deputies will be out there. So that was a save, but that happened at pretty much last minute. We had a couple of false starts, waiting to get clearance on those, on the legal and with the council. And then we found the sheriff. So the very first one, which was Jackson, and that was switched from the very first one was going to be Jeb Stewart. We had tried that twice, and it closed down at 5 a.m. at the loading site. So we were waiting at dawn for clearance, and we got the go-ahead, and the sheriff's deputies cleared a way for the caravan to go to the Jackson site. There weren't a lot of sheriffs, but the crowd was already there. It had been leaked that we were doing that. And but the crowd was friendly is the right word. There were very few people who did not want to see the monuments come down at the site at the time. If they were there, they were on the periphery of the crowd. And there were few. At one point, we were getting ready to lift the Jackson horse and rider off the stone base, the pedestal. And the sheriffs asked those of us on the ground to stand in between them, not to do anything, just to be there, because people were pressing in, and it was it's a construction site, and there were no barriers. So I went up to the tallest guy, who was given kind of suggestions to the crowd as to how to be where and what to do, and he was a leader. And I said, I wonder if you can help us out to keep the crowd back. And he said, I'd be glad to do that. Okay, we got to move back. And he starts directing people. And as he pulled away from me, I knew already that he had a rifle over his shoulder. I saw that. And I also saw one of the pistols on his hip. But he had another one on the other hip. And he also had one on his leg, on his calf. And had I seen all that, I might have not asked him. But he was very friendly. And he did a good job. Once the horse, there's a little video clip I'll give you that was shot by somebody in the crowd. It was purchased by, I'm not sure if it was purchased. It was shown online by the Times Dispatch writer. And it's a clip of the statue coming up off the base. And there, at the time when that started to happen, it started to rain, same time. And when it started to rain, it then started to thunder and lightning. Within a minute of getting ready to do this, the straps go in place, the rain's beginning to start. It's starting to come up. Lightning is cracking the sky, and in that situation, the crane operator makes the call. It's his crane. He's going to get electrocuted first and most. He's a dead man if it hits his equipment. And he said, we're rolling it. We're not putting it down. So he continued. The statue's coming up off the base. The crowd is cheering. I think it was about 1,500, 2,000 people. I think that's what they estimated. And the church on the corner had a bell that was made at the end of the Civil War, a bronze bell. And as I understand it, the call was between the pastor and the director of the church. Should we start ringing this bell? I mean, that was an insightful thing to say in terms of a historic moment. But they started ringing the bell. So now the statue's going up in the air, the lightning's cracking across the sky, and the bell starts ringing, and the crowd's cheering. I mean, it couldn't be set up better by Hollywood. It really couldn't. On the subject of surprises, there were many, of course. It surprised me that Devon was wearing a flak jacket initially, and then I understood entirely why he was wearing a flak jacket, and he offered it to other workers, including me. I didn't wear one. I was the only person who was local, and so if I had thought about it more, I might have done that, but looking back, of course, it's easy to say it it was reasonable not to bother with it because it's hot, right? In July, in August. But I didn't see that kind of animosity, that kind of violent animosity from the crowd. But I'm white. I don't have that same wiring as a black person would. I live in an integrated neighborhood, and I know a lot about how blacks and whites interact well together, because they're my neighbors and we like each other. They're my neighbors. But one of the surprises was talking with some of the workers who were there all the time, and I'd be shoulder to shoulder looking at things. Or I wasn't lifting or holding a shovel, except every once in a while. And one of Devon's managers was Mike out of Norfolk, and somebody went by and yelled out of this car something like to go home, or and of course always included a racial slur of some sort, or just swearing and that, and so that happened. And I was standing next to Mike, and I said, "How often does that happen?" And he said, "It happens a little less if you're standing next to me. Otherwise, it happens all day long. I'm sick of it. I'm really sick of hearing how people can't express themselves better," or something like that. I mean, Mike was a gem, and he's the man who was responsible for figuring out how to put all the stones in place so that they could come out again. So each stone, Robert E. Lee, for example, had over 600 stones for that one pedestal. Anyway, Mike masterminded that, and so he was at all the sites, and to hear him talk about going home in the evening or back to Devon's office in the evening, he said they would sit and listen to their phone machine and laugh at all the people calling in, raging over the telephone at him. And so these were surprises, because I'm insulated and naive to the mob anger that was out there. Other surprises were the mechanical things we had to do to get it to work. So, for example, the trucks that the tractor trailer is 12 feet wide, and then we're adding a foot on each side, so now we've got it 14 feet. And then in some cases they would add more and just increase the permit to track something down the highway at 16 feet wide. And so if I'd known that ahead of time, it would have been easier to figure out how to put some of these on the trucks. But as it was, Richmond didn't have to cut any of their statues. And the Robert E. Lee, what I said earlier is it could have been not taken apart at the waist. It could have been put on diagonally and just cut off one leg of the horse and part of the base plate, and it would have ridden down the highway fine. As it was, we were really lucky that it would travel at all, because it was perpendicular. The Robert E. Lee statue was perpendicular to the truck, and the picture, I took a couple of pictures of it going away and since at the laydown area where the statues are stored. And if this is the level truck and this is the base plate, the body of the horse is over here. And it's like this. It's just way, and the other thing is they had to move the body of the horse over to get it so they could drive it at all, which meant that nothing stuck out on this side of the truck, and over on this side of the truck, 5 feet out, was the base plate. So when they got to the prison, where they stored it initially, that's owned by the state. I think they call it like a farm or something. Yeah. So that's where it was stored initially. Nobody knew where it was going, but in order to get there, they had to go down this small little road and actually cut trees down because the legs were sticking out so far. Couldn't get down unless they did that. So the surprise there was that I couldn't get through to the state to make for one day I did, and then the out-of-town advisors got their way. So that's just, following orders. Well, in terms of talking about pride that I took in the job that I did, I felt that I gave good advice. I felt that on the ground I was useful in more ways than just watching out for the statues. But internally, I had initially mixed emotions about what to do with the statues. There was no doubt they needed to come down. Everybody was wondering what would be the best thing to do with them. Do we leave the bases up? Do we take all the bases down? We want to get rid of any reminder of what was here. We want to plant trees. And then because the storage area was a secret, there was no way that could be become an educational tool, and that may change in the future. What happened along the way is that I think it's the Getty Foundation has been talking with Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, LAMOCA, and also LAX-ART. LAX Art is the private, or this 501c3, also out of Los Angeles. So they're talking about leasing statues from cities around the country and putting them up in Los Angeles for 2 years on the ground and providing context as to who these people were and what part they played in history. And in a gated display area, acreage, have people come in and read the contextual signs that would be up. So that is really demonstrating what's possible and what use these statues have. And from my point of view, each of these statues is a time capsule by itself in terms of the craft and workmanship, and thinking about who did that work. It was a minority of white people doing that work, especially cutting the stone out of the quarry. And that led me into the inquiry as to finding photographs of that. And there are a few of quarries in Virginia and elsewhere where the workers are, of course, all black. This would be in the 1850s or earlier, maybe edging up towards the late 1800s. But still, the labor was skilled, and it was black labor, and there would be one white person holding a shovel, wearing a hat, typically, in those photographs. So this is a story that's not told. Most surprising to me was the monument in Charlottesville to George Rogers Clark. Now, he is the brother of the Clark, of Lewis and Clark. So I'm going to say there's a good brother and there's a bad brother. And George Rogers Clark, according to what I read about him, had a calling card that was on his card, Indian Killer. And he's quoted as saying, "Men, women, children, I kill them all." So in Charlottesville, along with when Robert E. Lee was given by the same benefactor, and Jackson, and the Lewis and Clark Pocahontas statue, which was in Charlottesville. Along with those was George Rogers Clark. And that statue pictures him on a horse. The horse is stopped short like a polo pony in front of 3 people, 4 actually, because one's a standing male with his arms crossed, another is Indian. They're all Indians. The other's on the ground with a blanket around him, and he's holding a dagger. And the third is a woman holding a washboard up with a baby in it, pleading for the baby's life. And George Rogers is reaching back, and behind him are 3 men. One has a pistol, one has a long gun, and the third is hugging a keg of dynamite. And he's asking for a gun so he can turn around and shoot the people in front of him. That's the narrative of that sculpture. And I went to see that, to talk about how to lift this off the base without destroying it. And I went to see it with Devon. And Devon rightly called it a statue to genocide. So you take that and change it, not change it, but just bring it to the African American situation who experienced similar murders of babies and children as well as adults. And it becomes clearer why these statues needed to come down. And in the case of George Rogers Clark, how do you contextualize that other than to talk about it in the same way you talk about Auschwitz? Well, there are a number of monuments going up around the country that are doing a good job of addressing the various issues, but the prominent one, of course, being enslaved people and the realities of that and the numbers that are involved that have been hidden over time. And I was disappointed that some of the institutions in Richmond were afraid to address the statues coming down. But of course, afraid is the operant word. The fear was generated by the riot and ongoing potential for riots that occurred in Richmond, that would occur or could occur. And by bringing a statue onto their property, somehow aligning themselves with, in a way that protesters or people unhappy with them coming down or being there and acting out on that. So, but I think that at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, the Kehinde Wiley statue called Rumors of War is particularly a good example because, of course, that statue was based on Jeb Stuart statue. Exactly. The horse is the same horse, scanned and printed out at the same scale as the Jeb Stuart. And, of course, the rider's different. And that's Kehinde Wiley's point. And a lot like Andy Warhol taking advantage of technology at the time, he took advantage of the technology of scanning and printing and then producing a bronze monument. Of course, it's standing right next to the Daughters of the Confederacy building. That's pretty appropriate in a lot of ways, but there's no effort to connect that contextually in terms of what art as public art can or does represent or could represent. And of course, in a way, you can't contextualize that. It's meant to be just the page in a book of the story, in a volume of the history, in the encyclopedia of the history that is the Civil War. But the point is that you do want to have that page to look at, turn to. You don't want to forget about it. And the more appropriate it can be, the better, as far as the interaction with other elements of history. So, we're not at a time where the daughters of the Confederacy will consider putting a statue in front of their building, but they, like everybody else, want to keep a low profile. But the Museum for History and Culture, not paying attention to it, well, they eventually will, but there'll be an exhibit about what happened, much like the foresightful work being done at Richmond Public Library that we're doing right now is telling a story or collecting information about the story. So, so in the broad subject of what to look at, it's going to develop and get better and richer and more apparent what the public can absorb over time. And as far as art that is generated by the removal of the statues, I think probably the worst idea that happened in Charlottesville is melting down a statue with the idea that you can make more art out of that bronze and that'll mean something. And what it really means is that you're melting bronze that has lead in it and you can't do anything with it. It's also getting rid of a time capsule that, for whatever reason, has its own inherent, for a lot of different reasons, has its own inherent value. The story about what it represented at the time it was put up, juxtaposed what it represents now as a person who, in the case of Lee, who was an enslaver, owned people, and at the same time went under his own restrictions as to what to do or not to do, and ultimately throwing his hat in with the South, even though his wife owned what's essentially, what's now Arlington Cemetery, would have been in the North, or considered the North. So, so the value of what gets presented will reveal itself over time. I think about the Arthur Ashe Monument, and when we put that up in 1996, I didn't think in 1993, when I started that with the Ashe family's permission, with Arthur Ashe's description of how he wanted the statue to present itself, what would be included, children and a warm-up suit, as I am today. None of that mattered. What mattered was that the political climate was such that Monument Avenue became where the majority of people in Richmond wanted to see it, because it was voted on that way. And I didn't think it would, initially I thought it was a bad idea. But in the context of those, there were 3 years really that it churned through 2 different city councils and a lot of committees. The question changed from why should Arthur Ashe be on Monument Avenue? He's a tennis player. 2, why shouldn't Arthur Ashe be on Monument Avenue? He's a world-renowned hero. And he's our hero. And once that shift occurred, it was going to happen. And then decades later, he's the last man standing for all the right reasons. So I expect shifts like that with these statues coming down. It's just that to obliterate them, to melt them down, to get rid of them is, to me, of course I have a bias here as a sculptor, and I know what it takes, especially back in the 1850s, 60s, 80s, even the 1920s. It doesn't matter. It's still a lot of work and a lot of skill and craftsmanship. And the fact that a lot of that work was done by black people needs to be revealed. There's history to be discovered there. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what can happen. So, yeah, I'm optimistic about other ways that's going to happen. I can't predict it. If I could predict it, well, actually, it's starting to happen in places. I'll mention this. So I'm working currently with the city of Rocky Mount, Virginia. And the county of Franklin County had 70 men who were born in Franklin County but enlisted in the Civil War, fighting for the Union toward the end of the war. That is news. That's new history. And it was discovered not long ago, and a grant was won, and they want to do a monument to those Union soldiers who were black men who came from Franklin County. They want to do it in Rocky Mount. And the council doesn't want to do that. The council didn't want to take down the Confederate statue that's standing right now in Rocky Mount. So this was suggested as a contextual balance to that. And there was pushback on it. So it hasn't happened yet. It's in the works. The grant has been approved. There are 25% of the population of the city is black, and they want to do it. The council has approved a statue going in at the Veterans Memorial Park, but there's really not a place for it, and the place that would be best would be in the town center. It would also benefit the city because it's a unique piece of history that town especially can own, and nobody else can own. There's no place else in Franklin County that could do it. So this is actually a brilliant idea, but it's running smack into that's not the history we learned, that we were told, that we learned in school. That's not the story that we're interested in. We don't want that story out there. And if you think about it, you look at a sculpture of a black soldier, any soldier who's black, and any soldier who's white or Indian. I suppose there'd be some races that you can tell a difference, but when they're in bronze, they pretty much look the same. So it's the story that's being told about these figures, and the story that is meaningful to people. But if the story is revealed as being untrue, or there's more truth that needs to be told, this is a good page of that book to turn to read about, or to find more history like that. So, to be honest, what I would like to see, although they haven't asked me for my opinion on adding to it, we've got a budget to work with, but I'd be willing to work with that budget along with other sculptor who I've involved in it, Rick Weaver out of Charlottesville. So Rick and I would be willing to work at the same budget and do 2 statues. We would like to do a statue larger than life, 7 foot, because if you do it life size, it looks smaller in bronze outside. So 2 statues, one Union soldier who's black, and one Confederate soldier who's white. And the context or the narrative would be, it's after the war, they're not holding their rifles or their guns in any aggressive fashion, they're just standing there, war, worn, and glad to be home. That, in my opinion, would be a home run into the bleachers. Like anything you see on the news or read in the paper, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And that's what people get from looking at stories that are told, that were told by people or are told by people who have the feet on the ground and, in this case, the hands on the equipment. And so, for example, looking out over what's essentially 2 football fields worth of land that's covered in stone that represent all the monuments, the pieces that are pulled apart, put into place on top of pallets so that they could be pulled out again and reassembled for a future purpose, which we don't know yet, because they're there because it didn't suit the purpose that they were initially made for. So somebody getting to see a picture of that would see it as these individual pieces that are man-made. And you don't see that historically anywhere except for ruins, like the pyramids. I mean, suppose the pyramids were all pulled apart and all the pieces are sold off. I mean, that would be a lot of pieces, but there are a lot of people who would like to have a piece of a pyramid, probably. If we were to pull apart the monuments and sell off those pieces, you don't get to see this monumental statement on what happened in Richmond in 2020 to 2022. Not just to Richmond as a microcosm of the United States, in this shift that occurs that's called Black Lives Matter. So, what people will get out of it is not just the stories that are told, but the photographs and the other video that occurred at the time that digs deeper into what happened and inspires what could happen with that question you asked earlier as to, well, now what? Where do we go from here? My parting comment would be, it's been a tough time for sculpture. It's gotten a bum rap in the sense that try to put up a sculpture that used to, well, I'm trying to put up a sculpture. I don't own it anymore, but I mentioned before we started the interview the statue of a Native American I did in Washington, D.C. in 1983 that sits on a rooftop and is 23 feet between elbows. It's just the bust of the sculpture. But the purpose of that sculpture was to honor Native Americans in the capital of America. And it worked. I self-produced it, but it was received well by the local Native American population. They came to the unveiling. It was put up not where I wanted it, in downtown Washington on Connecticut Avenue and Calvert Street, but instead out in the suburbs overlooking the Beltway, sponsored by Best Products Company, which collected art, so they were legit. But it didn't stay there. Of course, it went to the Diamond when they gave all their artwork to the Virginia Museum and gave the sculpture of the Indian back to me. And then it stayed at the Diamond for 25 years. And then it was moved when the squirrels went in to a historic site overlooking Chief Powhatan's land, and in particular the tidal basin where he got 13 tribes to come together and not kill each other during hunting and fishing season. So it was there for 10 years, and now it had to come down because other buildings were going up. So now where does that sculpture go? Well, whereas it used to be popular, particularly among Native Americans, because it declared Indian territory, which is America, is our America, is the Indians' America, is the Indians' territory. But now there's the unpopularity of public sculpture is such that it doesn't fit the cultural idea that that some of the chiefs have told me that it doesn't represent our art. It doesn't represent our culture. It's not meant to do that. And I'm also a white man making a sculpture of a red man. I'm not even from here. So it's like, do any of those things matter in terms of putting up a sculpture that lets people know that this is Indian territory? But that doesn't matter that that's my intent. What matters is how people react to it. But I guarantee you there are 100 to 1 white people that don't even know that Indians were here. Or if they do, they couldn't name one tribe. Or maybe they would be able to say Powhatan, get those words out on account of Pocahontas, right? And Thanksgiving or whatever. But there are 13 tribes, 7 of them are recognized, and they're mystery. So sculpture, there is a future for sculpture, but I'd like to find a place to put the Indian that so he could do his job again.